Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers, and I'm with the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence here at RTI International. I will be your technical lead and host and moderator for today's event. Today's presentation and webinar is entitled Psychological Survival in a Violent Career, and our wonderful subject matter expert and presenter today is Dr. David Christiansen. Dr. Christiansen is a licensed psychologist in Colorado and has been in private practice for more than 30 years, much of that time devoted to working with first responders by conducting pre-employment evaluations, fit-for-duty evaluations, and providing therapy to many first responders from various disciplines. He has also provided numerous trainings around the country with the intent to inoculate first responders from the effects of PTSD and to provide amelioration for those already affected with the negative consequences. Dr. Christiansen maintains an active private practice as well as serving many agencies as a consultant. He previously taught as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Northern Colorado in both the undergrad and graduate programs in psychology. Just a quick disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without any further ado, I would like to switch everyone's layout to our presentation and our slides today, and I would like to hand the microphone over to Dr. David Christiansen. Dr. Christiansen, you might have your phone muted. We're not able to hear you right now.
All right, is that better?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for attending today. I'm excited about this presentation, and it will be somewhat difficult to condense it to an hour, but I'm looking forward to presenting some ideas to a bright audience who's able to make use of the data well after we're done today. I spent the last 30 years, much of it working with law enforcement, firefighters, paramedics, EMTs, social workers, attorneys, many of those who have been affected by trauma through their career. I come at this with a great deal of respect for people who put themselves in a position to be traumatized by their work, not just once or twice or 5 times in a lifetime like most normal people, but to be traumatized over and over again in the course of their work, serving other people. So it's with deep respect that I come to this kind of a group and say thank you for your work, thank you for what you expose yourself to, for the emotional consequences that go along with that. I'm excited about presenting this to you. Several things have combined to bring me to this point. One is my work with law enforcement, specifically as a consultant. The second is my work as a teacher at UNC in Northern Colorado, teaching a class called Community Psychology, in which we started to apply therapy concepts not just to individuals or couples or families, but to a whole community. For example, a school system or a county or some large group of people that have been affected by a mental health issue such as a tornado or hurricane or something of that effect. So looking at that from a preventative standpoint, how do we inoculate people against PTSD? How do we help people who are going to be traumatized by their work? So over the course of the past 30 years, I've had many folks come in, and similar symptoms are expressed and similar cures have been found through what I do. So I've condensed that into this webinar today. The first slide up there gives us the introduction to it. I'm going to move to the second slide here. This takes me back to my bachelor program when I was exposed to philosophy for the first time. And the essence of this is that we learn, we interpret truth, we take truth into our hearts through one of 3 means. The first of those being through empiricism. And without belaboring this too long, basically what we're saying is that people obtain truth, they believe things to be true because of their own 5 senses. So they've tasted it, touched it, smelt it, felt it themselves. That's the most common way for us to believe that things are true. We have tasted food, we have seen things with our own eyes, we've heard things with our own ears. And so we believe those things to be true, and for the most part, we can trust our sensory data to give us accurate information. From empiricism, from that biological standpoint or sensory standpoint, we look at the brain, and the brain then becomes a piece of matter or piece of electronic equipment housed in a shell of water that does the functions of the brain. And if you believe that mental health issues are treated by treating the brain, then we head towards chemicals and medical interventions, and we prescribe medications and so on for people who have mental illness due to brain functioning. That would be one way of looking at this. As we're going to see, there are other ways of looking at data. The second one being rationalism, that not only do we have physical sensory data, but we have the capacity to think and to interpret and to teach and to learn. And so one of the ways that we obtain truth is by what we've been taught. And so most of us as adults realize that our sensory data has been fooled, for example, seeing a mirage, and also our rationalism, our training, our teaching has been not always true. We've been taught things that we don't believe as adults. But when you look at rationalism, you're saying that I believe this to be true because I've thought it through, I see the logic of this, it makes sense to me, therefore I believe it to be true. When we do that, we shift from looking at the brain to looking at the mind. And of course, those are two different things. The mind has the capacity to interpret and to look at things in creative ways and to look at things differently. And so when we think about the mind, we think about people who have interpreted data, perhaps accurately and perhaps inaccurately, but it becomes different from the brain in that we're now looking at how the person thinks or feels. Third school of thought, which emerged, was existentialism, and this one always gives me a little bit of pause because it's so deep. But essentially what I have taken from existentialism is that we also obtain truth not from sensory data and not from logic, but things that we feel in our heart. We might say a spiritual sense of ourselves. And so we believe something to be true. We believe that we have a calling in life. We believe that we love somebody. We believe that something is possible for us, even though our sensory data and our thinking typically go against that. So a person may learn to run a marathon or have a certain job or obtain something that they never thought possible. And it comes from this deeply heartfelt belief that this is possible for me and I can do it. Sometimes that flies in the face of empiricism. For example, a person doesn't have the physical capabilities to do something, and yet by having the heart and the strength and the spirit, they're able to accomplish that. It can also go against rational thinking that other people say that can't be done, or that's not financially responsible, or I just don't see how this works for you. But in our hearts, we know something to be true. So these three forms of obtaining data, making ourselves true, determine who we are. And of course, all of us blend those in different ways to obtain a truth that we believe to be true for ourselves. Having said that, that's the premise that we work from, is that we have philosophical underpinnings for everything that we believe. When I began in psychology, I was also informed and learned about the brain, and that the brain has two hemispheres that also kind of correlate with philosophy. The left brain being the one that thinks in sensory data and that looks at things logically and analytically and linearly, so that some people seem to be gifted in mathematics and linear thinking and work that is basically left brain oriented, such as carpentry or plumbing or electricity or auto mechanics. There are certain trades or certain work that we do that is scientifically based, and the left brain seems to be geared for that. There are other people who seem to be less analytical and more imaginative in their thinking. And these people tend to go towards the arts and towards more expressive forms of work that doesn't necessarily go along with science. So we see that these things are true as well. People have right brain careers, right brain personalities that make them very lively people. To simplify this, not make it too, obviously the drawing is pretty basic here, But the left brain functions in this way, that when we see our environment, when we look at things, there are certain people that could just see what exists. They can see trees or houses or sidewalks and roads, and they see things analytically. And typically, we call this the male brain because men are more likely to look at life through the left brain and analyze things and see things simply for what they are. The right brain, however, has more emotion to it. And so we would typically in the past have called this the feminine brain, or one that has more expressiveness to it, more feelings to it. And so two people looking at the same thing, one may see, as I mentioned, the streets and the roads and the sidewalks and the trees. And another person may see life. They may see that the trees are budding or that the leaves are fading. They may see houses that have been painted recently, and they notice that. They see children on the sidewalk. They see children riding bicycles for the first time. They see things that are certainly real, but they see the life that's behind that. They see the artistry of a house being repainted or a child's expression on their face. And so people who work out of the right brain are more likely to see things that are imaginative or artistic or relational in nature. So we take all that and look at people who are in law enforcement or crime folks, and we say for the most part, they are trained to work with their left brain, to be analytical, to walk into a crime scene and to look at crime evidence, blood spatter or tire tracks or fingerprints. And they're asked to do left brain work, which is to analyze and to use scientific processes to break down the data, to basically present a case to the judicial system in order to find a person guilty of a crime. So, so folks that look at things through the left brain are more scientifically based. They are more looking at things that actually exist, that are more empirical in nature. So we get into law enforcement or crime scene investigators or forensic sciences. These people typically are more prone to left brain functioning, and so the right brain is put on mute as they do their work. However, if we look at this right brain slide, we see many emotions that are here. That there's emotions on the top that include laughter and sex and joy and caring and love, and also fear and anger and hurt feelings. Those are all emotions that are actually acceptable and that all of us feel free to share with each other. We have those. The slide that means a lot to me is this one where we darken that line. And if you print out copies of this, please notice that the line is on this brain, because it isolates and it shows that there are some emotions that are held in check. We might say the subconscious or the unconscious, but they're pushed down because they're not easily expressed or they're not socially appropriate. For example, you can't tell a random stranger some personal things about yourself because it would seem inappropriate to them. So the line represents emotions that any individual decides that they should not share this emotion. So that may be hatred, it may be a strong anger, it may be something like lust or disgust, or just a kind of an emotional reaction that they don't feel is socially appropriate. So if we look at this slide and watch a law enforcement officer or crime lab scientist examining data, for the most part, they want to stay away from the right brain. They want to just look at data. I've attended autopsies and asked persons present, how do you look at this? How do you do this for a living? And they would say to me, it's just a body. So this was a person yesterday, this was a son or a daughter, this was somebody who was active in life, and now they're just a body. And scientists tend to prefer to do things that way because it keeps the information in the left brain. They tend to not feel, they tend to just analyze data and process it that way. However, there are times where any crime scene, any evidence that we find, or autopsies and so on, do evoke an emotional response in us. Sometimes it's handled with humor, sometimes it's handled with casual conversation, but sometimes it's handled by the person just pushing down the emotion and saying, I wish I didn't feel this way, or I don't feel this way, and I can't share this with anybody. And so those are the emotions that get activated with things that we call trauma, or worse is when PTSD kicks in. I just want to make this point again before I move on, that emotions that we have towards crime scenes or towards evidence, those things do have an emotional effect on us. But when we practice this, when we consider ourselves professionals, we believe that we should stay in the left brain and just see evidence and stay that way. However, there are cases where the evidence, the things that we are looking at, do evoke emotions in us. If those are socially acceptable, we say this sucks, or this is terrible, or this is uncomfortable. If it's worse than that, oftentimes we just keep it to ourselves, and that leads to trouble. The most common definition for this, when we put it beneath the shelf, when we hold things privately, is that it results in anxiety. And I don't have to read the slide to you, but you can see these are the symptoms that show us that anxiety is present. Now, when I first studied psychology and heard about anxiety, it just did not click with me because I don't feel like I experienced anxiety. I certainly was nervous before a speech or a sports event, but I had no idea that anxiety was so prevalent that it basically is present for everything that we do. Not necessarily traumatic anxiety, not necessarily noticeable, but anxiety is ever present, and it's at the core of many psychological theorists that this is the doorway into mental health issues. One of the paradigm shifts that I've experienced myself over the years has been to not see anxiety as simply an emotion, but to categorize it as possibly more than that. Most people are familiar with adrenaline, but many people don't know that adrenaline comes from hormonal glands called the adrenal glands, which are located on top of the kidneys. We have two sets of those. And I consider the adrenal glands to be small cans of Red Bull, that if you open one, you're going to open both. People call that the adrenaline rush. They feel it significantly. It's very excitable. It's a wonderful thing to experience if you're doing something athletic or that requires it, to climb a mountain or to do something physical that requires all of your effort. Adrenaline can be a friend to many people, and it's a wonderful chemical to have in our bloodstream because it affects our entire body and it seems to energize it in ways that we enjoy. Some people become adrenaline junkies, and some people just enjoy the presence of adrenaline. But most of us don't know that adrenaline is a hormone and that it's released into the bloodstream, which affects the entire body. This brings us back to one of the scientific experiments that nearly everyone is familiar with, and that is Pavlov, who in 1904 was studying the saliva that dogs developed when they were presented with food. And I would guess that most people are familiar with this experiment, but the bell was rung, let's say at 2 o'clock, and some grams of food powder were put in the dish, and Dr. Pavlov was going to measure how much saliva it took. Well, the whole point of this experiment that made it so famous, that makes it present today, is that saliva glands can be trained to respond to a bell. This was theoretically the first dog ever to salivate to a bell. The importance of this cannot be overstated, that training involuntary body functions is huge. It affects most of the people that I work with. In that, if saliva can be trained, then so can the heart rate and respirations and digestion, and probably most importantly, adrenal glands, which none of us have seen in ourselves, that they can be trained. Unfortunately, adrenal glands are often trained in a negative direction. That is, the bell rings and we have adrenaline, but we don't know how to shut it off. And so adrenaline becomes, to me, the paradigm shift from anxiety being an emotion versus anxiety having a physiological effect on my body. So one of the helps that I think is present in this webinar today is that people recognize the difference between anxiety, which is an emotion, nearly being hit by a car as we're driving, fearing we're going to be late for a meeting, those kinds of things. Typical anxiety emotions are one thing, but anxiety which evokes a physiological response is a mark of trauma, in my opinion. So as I've noticed in my own life, the difference between here's my emotional anxiety versus, wow, I just had adrenaline, I just had a physiological response to this, that is a clear indicator to me that potential problems may follow, because the body tends to remember, it tends to lock in to physiological responses to traumatic events, which, as we'll see, are now triggered by things not necessarily present in the original event. What I mean by this is that most people, again, who take Psych 101 and are exposed to classical conditioning don't realize that the bell that made the dog salivate could then be preceded by a buzzer or a light or another sound altogether, and the dog would also salivate to that. So what we get then is secondary or tertiary conditioning, so that now the dog is salivating to things 2 or 3 steps removed from the original food. And in humans, the trauma that they experience, the emotion, the strong emotion of sadness or hurt or rejection, that doesn't necessarily have to be triggered by the original food or by the original bell. It can be triggered by things similar to that. And so this is where people feel crazy. And when they come to my office, they're often asking to unwind this process and say, why do I react so strongly to this situation or to my child or to my spouse? And when we do the work in therapy, people recognize that they have made 2 or 3 steps away from the original trauma, away from the original physiological response to these triggers that we call them. And so when the trigger goes off, the person reacts with saliva, with adrenaline, with rapid heart rate, with a loss of sleep, when what has happened in their life doesn't make sense to them because it's removed from the original food pattern, if you will. So let's go back to now to the philosophy that this is an empirical event. This is something that we could measure. If all of us had an adrenaline measuring stick, we could poke our fingers and find out how much adrenaline we had. This would be an empirical problem, and we could deal with it that way. We can also understand it cognitively, as I just explained, and I hope people who are curious will look into this more. But I want to get to this third category, and that is an existential response or an existential trauma. And here's the difference. When I work with officers who have come to see me for a fit for duty evaluation following the shooting, if they are the ones who have done the shooting, they often have a cognitive response to that. It was him and me, and I'm going home to my family. This was a good shoot. It was necessary. It was protecting the public. They rationalize it, and I mean that in a good way, that there's nothing to fear in losing their job or having some kind of disciplinary action. It's a rational experience for them. However, I have worked with many people in my office who come not for fit for duty, but they have an existential trauma. And this is what that means to me. An existential trauma is when a person says, holy cow, I almost didn't go home to my family tonight. I don't know if I can pull my weapon again. I don't know if I can attend to a fire again. I don't know if I can come to work next week after what I just experienced with the crime scene evidence, with the crime itself, with people who have seen horrible things. I think I'll take a moment and just kind of give you an example of this. I worked with an officer who casually mentioned to his supervisor that the night previously had been his worst night ever as a cop. He'd been with the department for 12 or 15 years. And the supervisor walked past nonchalantly and said, I'm sorry about that, and kept walking. And later on, I checked on the officer, and I asked him if he would do a ride-along with me, and he agreed. So I got into his vehicle. He immediately drove me to the scene where a teenage boy had flipped his car at a high rate of speed, and the car caught on fire. And he was summoned to the accident, and witnessed as the boy in the car was burned alive, basically, and he was crying for help. and there were firefighters there, and he was there, and they could not extract the boy until they beat back the flames, which eventually they did, but when they pulled the boy out, he was basically charcoaled. Because he was making noise, because there was some sign of life, the deputy had to call Flight for Life and describe what they were coming to pick up. And at that point, he began to break down. And so after this was all over, of course, the boy had passed away. His reaction to this was, why do I do this kind of work? How can I see this kind of thing? How do you unsee this? How do you ever recover from this kind of thing? So a cognitive response to this, or an empirical response would be, this is what happens to cars when they roll and they've got fuel and so on. A rational response to this would be explaining that data and saying, this is how it makes sense. Here's the evidence that the physics that are involved in this kind of thing. However, his response to that, in addition to being a good cop, is existential in nature. It is an existential trauma. And that is, how many of these can I see before I go nuts? How many of these can I see before I don't want to come to work again? And so when I sat there with him at the scene of this accident the night afterwards, and everything had been cleaned up and the tree was charred and so on, is we just had this long talk about why he became a cop in the first place. And the existential trauma was so evident with tears and with the statements about, can I come back to work? Can I keep doing this? How does a person have a career in this field for 25 years? Those kinds of questions. We talked about all of that and basically talked through that what he did is very strong. In this case, I was interested in preventing PTSD. Now, I don't know if that's possible, but it's certainly worth talking about. It's certainly worth understanding it ahead of time. I've done numerous things in my own personal life where the trauma was removed because the person explained to me ahead of time, this is what's going to happen. For example, in skydiving, if you just were thrown out of a plane with a parachute, it would be traumatic. But if someone explains to you ahead of time, this is what's going to happen, this is what a free fall is like, this is what the jar is like when the chute opens, this is how you control it, this is what you do when you land, it really mitigates the effects of trauma because you're already prepared for that. So when I do the training, it's part of my intention is to inoculate those who've not been traumatized yet by saying, have a game plan. Know that this is what's going to happen. Know what a free fall is like. Know what existential despair is like. Because then when it happens to you, you'll have a vocabulary for that. You'll have some resources in place for that. You don't just need a new uniform or a new weapon or new lab tools. You need to have somebody who repairs your heart. Let's look at PTSD and let's prevent that before it ever happens. So the slide you have before you now goes through PTSD, and let me just explain this real briefly. The post part of PTSD is dependent on several factors. One is resiliency. Another is hardiness, and another is the pre-morbid condition. What was the person like before the trauma? Resiliency is really the basis of a person's ability to bounce back, to after the snow melts for the tree to stand upright again. It's that sense of I bounce back to who I was before. Hardiness is that strength of character, where people may rely on their genealogical history, their definition of who they are as a person, and the pre-morbid condition refers to who was the person before the trauma happened. The question why now is that the post part of post-traumatic is probably the most difficult, and that is because some folks hold on to trauma for several months, some for years, some for as many as 20 or 30 years before they talk about it. That stuff that I mentioned earlier is so powerful that the person puts more and more trauma underneath that shelf, and it stays there for 15 or 20 years before they come to therapy or before it bursts through their choices of alcoholism or anger, those kinds of things. So the question why now, I don't think we have an answer for. What we want to do is make the post-traumatic response, the post-traumatic cure, follow as close as we can to the trauma. If a person can get help immediately, that'd be better. What is traumatic? Why does a person experience many traumatic incidents without any effects, and then a more simple, a more common event happens, and they are triggered by that? I don't have an answer for that either, but I know that a person who experiences 50 traumas, 50 traffic accidents, 50 deaths is not immune from the next one. The next one might be the one that triggers all of the trauma. And so we have to understand that, and a person can feel weak or unable to do their work if a fairly simple traffic accident makes them feel traumatically or existentially aroused when they've dealt with many more difficult things. We don't know what causes trauma for one person and not the other. When we look at stress, we're looking at a couple of things here. I'll just mention on the next line there, the hot or cold firing. What happens with this is that officers on the scene of an accident may cold fire or left brain fire at the scene of the accident. In other words, they are trying to protect public safety. They're trying to analyze the scene. They're trying to measure things to see if there's a crime involved. They basically function on a logical level. They're looking at things as a law enforcement officer, as a crime scene investigator, as a lab technician. They're looking at things through their left brain. However, once the scene is done, once the person is home safe again, they may have a hot firing or right brain reaction. In other words, holy cow, what did I just do? What did I just see? How can I go to sleep tonight after dealing with this domestic violence scene, or looking at these slides, or analyzing the situation? So a hot firing person is somebody who has an emotional reaction after the fact, and this is often once they're back home and they feel safe. When they hot fire, they have lots of these emotions that can come out towards their family. They're more angry, they're more despondent. Those things, the hot firing person at home is basically reacting to the scene, but they waited until they were in the safety of their own home before they reaction. Stress can be chronic or acute. It can be a buildup. Some officers that I've seen have responded to 100 situations, and it's eventually caught up with them, and then they start to question existentially, did I choose the right career? Is this the right place for me to be? Those kinds of things. Or it can be acute, that I've dealt with officers who just came from very difficult crime scenes or very difficult traffic accidents, and it becomes acute. What makes post-traumatic stress a disorder is that people who function this way, who are triggered, who can't sleep, who react to things more strongly than they should, who have physiological responses to things that others don't, that separates this person from the norm. So most dogs that hear a bell don't salivate. If my dog salivates to a bell, that's different. Most people don't get violently angry by standing in the wrong line at the store. Most people don't get violently angry when they're cut off in traffic. But PTSD is when a person has these excessive emotions to a fairly simple cause that other people don't react to nearly as strongly. And that's what sets them apart. Either their spouses report it, or the person themselves comes and they tell me, Dave, I feel crazy. What's going on with me? And we have to unwrap that. So disorder is determined by a person's self-report. I'm not sleeping like I used to. I have intrusive thoughts. I'm overreacting to my children. Those kinds of things, and that's what makes something a disorder. Let's spend a few minutes talking about dealing with stress successfully. First of all, we have to understand that stress is a naturally occurring response. We should feel stressed in certain situations. All of us do. It's a common emotion that is experienced by every person. It can be chronic or acute, meaning that I can live in a chronic state of stress where my adrenaline is firing all the time. or it can be just a sudden burst of an accident or an immediate event which creates the presence of adrenaline in the system. I think most people listening are familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze of the parasympathetic nervous system. The adrenaline essentially activates usually one of these, and once we have a pattern, we're more likely to have that same response, the fight, the flight, or the freeze for the remainder of our lives. It's important for us to know which of these that we do. I've covered the hot versus cold firing persons, that a person who cold fires in a scene, who looks like an amazing cop or amazing paramedic because they handle things so well, they may be very difficult once they get home. They may be very difficult if they're by themselves. They may be suicidal. They may have strong emotional reactions once they're away from the scene. Now, on scene, in uniform, giving directives, they look like the ultimate professional. Or even in the laboratory, the person looks professional, they say things professionally, but when they get alone, they have this hot firing response, which means that adrenaline is flowing for one of the reasons that I explained earlier, for an empirical reason, a rational reason, or an existential reason. Now, when we look at Pavlov, it's more important than just looking at the dogs. It's one of the most important psychological concepts that came out of the 20th century, because we are learning now, we have over the past several decades, that things that we thought were not possible to train, such as our respiratory systems, our heart rate, our saliva, our sweating, our nervousness, that those things can be trained by training the internal parts of our body. We can train our adrenal glands, and that's the focus of what I'm doing today. We can train our autonomic nervous system to not respond. Now, when we do that, we're actually helping a person not become overly angry or overly depressed or overly stressed or losing sleep because of anxiety. We're training people to not do that. So in general, the work of dealing with stress successfully, the way to handle stress in a violent career is to have a game plan for moving things from the right brain, the expressive, emotional right brain, into the left brain where it's archived as we might put it into a library. We can remember incidents, but we are not triggered by them. We don't have an emotional response to those things. We don't get filled with adrenaline at inappropriate times. So moving traumatic events from the right brain to the left brain is the essence of the work that I do. That gets accomplished by a couple of things. Verbal communication with friends, with intimates, with a therapist, require vocabulary words, and vocabulary itself is in the left brain. And so as a person describes traumatic events, the event itself is moving from the right brain to the left brain. It's being archived. The person can let it go. They can forget about it. They can put it in a place where it is not disruptive, and it's not vulnerable to triggers activating these poor responses. So verbally talking about traumatic events is probably the number one recommendation that any therapist would have for someone who's been traumatized. So one of the things that we want to do to psychologically survive repeated exposure to trauma is to have an intimate group of friends with whom we can share emotions that are not socially appropriate for others. We want to have colleagues. We want to have somebody perhaps in a different department. We want to have intimates in our lives who say, if you want to talk about something that's difficult, I'm here for you. It's also important to remember that most of us respond to traumatic events with some distance. That person has already expired. There's nothing that we could have done to change things. We can't go back in our minds and undo what has happened. We have to see things empirically, which is how most people in the profession survive in the first place. They just see domestic violence and traffic accidents and death, even death of children, as being empirical. But here's the cause of death. They don't get emotionally involved in who the person was. The other thing I want to offer before I bring some closure and handle questions is the 3 B's, and that is it possible, or how would Pavlov train our adrenal glands to shut off? Is that possible to do? And the wonderful answer is yes. We can turn off the adrenal glands. We can stop them from contributing at the moment of trauma, and we can stop them from contributing when we are triggered with post-traumatic stress, that we are now not sleeping a week later, we're having anger responses. We can turn off the adrenal glands intentionally. The ways that I recommend for my patients are as follows: the body, the breathing, and the brain. The first thing is that you want to check your body for any muscle tension that comes from the trauma. For example, some people might cringe, some people might clench their jaw, some people might have a stomach ache, some might have a headache, some might make fists. But when the body responds to a traumatic event, it tends to remember what that body action is, and it repeats that later. So a person who makes a fist or clenches their jaw at the moment of trauma is likely to do that again weeks or months or sometimes years later. If you can imagine some violations of people that happen, that they're traumatized, perhaps like an assault, well, their body has remembered the reaction that they needed, and it will do that for years afterwards. So the first way of dealing with adrenaline control is to control the body, is to relax the body from head to toe or toe to head until you can recognize that your body is fully relaxed. When the body is tense, it turns on adrenaline. We don't want that. When the body is relaxed, there's no effort made to have adrenaline. The second B is that even if my body is relaxed, if my breathing is elevated, if my breathing is excessive, it will activate adrenaline. So the second B of this formula is that I reduce my breathing. I take the deep breaths, and most people in law enforcement and paramedics and so on have learned to calm themselves with deep breathing. But that's the second B, and it's like a second way of turning off adrenaline, is to make sure that my body is relaxed and my breathing is reduced. The third B, and the most difficult of these, is to turn off the brain so that I don't think about what I just saw, what I witnessed, what I have to deal with, what I have to testify in court. And to me, the best way to turn off the brain is to make a choice about what I'm going to think about. So I often ask my patients that if you walk into the bedroom to go to sleep at night and you don't have a plan, your brain will do whatever it wants to do. It will bring up unpaid bills, and it will bring up any kind of issues that you haven't finished for the day. But if you walk into the bedroom with a plan, that you're going to plan your vacation, that you're going to remember positive things in your life, that you're going to read a book and retain it, that you're going to basically fantasize in some way about your life, that someday I'm going to go to this particular place and vacation. When we walk into the bedroom with a plan for our brain, it's not as susceptible to going back to traumatic events and activating adrenaline and keeping us awake. And one of the most important things with PTSD or exposure to trauma is that a person gets back on a regular sleep cycle. Josh, I'm ready to take any questions or review anything that didn't come across as well as I hoped.
All right, thank you, Dr. Christiansen. We do have a few questions that have come in, so we'll jump into those. We've also had quite a few comments from our audience members, so please feel free, audience, to keep those questions coming. Our first question is from Kimberly. She's asking, is the adaptation of gallows humor considered a positive, rational way of dealing with traumatic situations?
I would say for the most part, yes. And for the most part, gallows humor is in the rational area. That it's people, when you tell the joke, when you make a joke about the crime scene and the person responds with humor, they're basically saying, yes, I'm okay. If they respond with negativity, they may have been existentially traumatized, where the humor is no longer appropriate. The person does have feelings about the deceased or the crime scene, and the humor then offends them. And so it's okay to use the humor, but if a person doesn't reciprocate that, you have some kind of a sign that they have had an existential rather than irrational response to the trauma. I think humor is very necessary And thank God we don't want the public to hear those kinds of things, but it's a way of checking on each other.
Okay, we did have a few comments as well to the gallows humor. Nikki said, I believe gallows humor is an appropriate outlet if you're in a closed group, such as colleagues or fellow responders, but perhaps it's not appropriate at a cookie exchange or a dinner party. What are your feelings on setting and who the humor is directed with?
Absolutely protect it from the public. The public does not understand that this is a way of releasing it. As I just mentioned, it's a way of checking on our colleagues to see if they also find the humor in it, which to me indicates that they're doing okay, that they're not existentially traumatized. I think it's a great way to assess each other. And the humor, I've been a part of it, I've listened to it. It's a great way of having a bonding experience that we're all okay, we're going home. This is not our issue. This is something we're dealing with professionally.
Next question we have is asking about what's the Yerkes-Dodson law in terms to PTSD?
The Yerkes-Dodson law basically is that we can, certain emotions can be good to a certain effect and then begin to go downhill. So relating to humor, and another question on that, if that's all we do is humor, essentially it can be a good trait immediately, and that can be a bad trait overall. If we never look at our careers honestly, if we never appreciate what we're doing professionally. So it's saying that any given emotion or any given experience can be good for a while, and then after a while it tapers off, it loses its effectiveness. Just using humor to cope would be a poor way of doing that. You want to have a variety of responses to do it. So you never use humor unseen, but go home and cry with your spouse, or call a colleague, or call your parent, and have this deeper conversation. So to me, the Yerkes-Dodson law is that I can use something effectively, but continued use of it, it begins to taper off and it becomes a detriment.
All right. Next question, and Dr. Christiansen, some of your answers are a bit low. If you wouldn't mind just speaking a little loudly so all of our audience is able to hear. The next question is, the 3 B's sound directly related to mindfulness meditation. Do you think meditation is a good methodology to regulate the 3 B's?
Yes, I think it's excellent. And it's a way of, to me, meditation, mindfulness, the 3 B's are all existential in nature. Is that I walk into my home, I'm safe, I don't have to deal with this. I certainly don't have to bring these incidents into my home through my head. I don't have to pace, I don't have to stay awake, I don't have to lose my appetite. So to me, mindfulness is a way of walking in my home and having a presence here that is safe. That's my kingdom, if you will. It's my safe place, and it's a way of being in the here and now. That I'm grateful for the home that I have and for the things that I have that mean something to me, and it's being in this moment as opposed to still being on the crime scene or still being in the lab. I am here now, and let me experience my home tonight. Let me experience the people here, the things that I enjoy, and especially my resting place. Let me appreciate that, and it restores me.
Okay, next question we have is asking, going back to gallows humor, does humor act as a distraction, though? Just wondering if it prolongs the inevitable existential crisis.
I think one of the major points I'd like to make in this time frame is that we have to have some existential friendships within the field and perhaps outside the field that we're in. So yes, I think humor, the gallows humor, can be a blanket, a response to things that we get the humor. But if we're troubled by that, if we hot fire at home, we have to have people to talk to that said, that scared me to death. I feel terrible about these people, what they went through, how they died. We have to have these existential relationships where we are close and connected, where we don't fear judgment, so that I think the humor is a more socially appropriate way within the field to share it, but we have to have these relationships that are deeper. And the folks that get in the most trouble are those who believe that they can't share it with anybody, and they will appear weak. And I think that culture in law enforcement in general has changed over the last decade or more. It's beginning a place where seeking a therapist or talking about it is being accepted.
Okay, we have quite a few people that have asked pretty much the same question. What are your thoughts on critical incident response debriefings, CISD, following a traumatic incident for police officers? And then another one of our attendees chimed in and said, we just had a mandatory debrief for the borderline shooting as we lost one of our sergeants. Several of the participants felt it was ridiculous for it to be mandatory. They didn't want to be there and felt as if the debrief brought back all the feelings that caused the trauma. What are your thoughts?
First of all, I appreciate anybody's response like that, who feels forced into it and so on. I do appreciate that. My thoughts on it, having done many, many debriefings, is that it's generally helpful for two reasons. One is that it fills in the gap cognitively or chronologically. This is why people did what they did. And so you begin to see the whole picture as if you're rising above it in a helicopter and looking at the whole scene. You know why certain people did what they did. And so when you're in the critical moment, you might be doing your part but not seeing the big picture. So I think one of the benefits of a debriefing is you begin to see the big picture cognitively, because different people talk in a chronological order of why they did what they did, and that's helpful just for the mind to say, okay, I see the bigger picture now. Emotionally, again, if a person is existentially traumatized, it really hits them in their heart. They don't want to be a part of a group because it's socially inappropriate in that context. So when I do debriefings, I want to be careful that we're not asking people to share these deeper feelings, but emotionally it does connect us that we are all bothered by this particular scene. We don't do critical incidents for more simple crime scenes or for more simple deaths, if you will. I've joked with officers that if I were to die in a single car accident, nobody's traumatized by that. I'm an older guy and I've lived a life and no one would be bothered by it. But when a person's traumatized or when it does affect others, then the presence of other people in the room who share that, the horror, the sadness, the unusual complexity of the situation, it does help most of us bond emotionally at some level. If, however, the person's pain is deeper than that, I can see why they would be offended at the forced nature of that. But I would say attend the debriefing, contribute what you can, and still go find that existential relationship to deal with the deeper issues. But sometimes those older officers who are troubled, they offer a great deal of hope to other people just by being present and by sharing the socially appropriate parts of it. But again, if it's my issue and it's very deep, I don't want to be forced to be in a group to do that. However, I can go to the group and contribute a lesser amount of that, if you will, and save the deepest parts of my trauma with people who are close
Dr.
to me.
Christiansen, it seems like a lot of our audience members have the same viewpoint about things being forced. What are in your opinion, some of the ways that we can possibly get away from mandatory CISDs if they are actually could be harmful to certain people?
I think the harmful part of this is individually determined. And again, no therapist, nobody in the healing profession wants to treat somebody who doesn't want to be there. I fully appreciate that. However, on the other hand, if we don't require people, if we don't make it important, what we have seen is that people who don't get help end up with police suicide, with alcoholism, with obesity, with many marriages, with all the things that complicate life in dramatic ways. And my personal belief is that many of these other issues in the lives have come from trauma that was not dealt with. So it is a catch-22 that if we don't have CISD, if we don't address these things, I think many people are harmed by it. Again, if I am troubled by a scene in an existential way, I can still go to a group and contribute some amount to that. And I can appreciate the resentment with that, but it's necessary, I think, for the most part.
We do have some questions coming in. Before we move on to those, just want to make sure the audience is aware of everything that is on the screen. This is Dr. Christiansen's website, phone number, as well as his Facebook. And then when we switch into our closing, you will see his direct contact email that he was given out to the audience as well. So we appreciate those outlets of communication for you, Dr. Christiansen. Next question we have is asking, when law enforcement personnel are operational, should they practice the 3 Bs during or immediately after exposure?
This will go back to the mindfulness question earlier, but you can practice the 3 Bs ahead of time. You can practice them on a daily basis. If I'm in the wrong line, if I'm cut off in traffic, if some other urgent thing happens in my life, I want the 3 Bs available to me quickly, simply to mitigate my adrenaline. Is adrenaline going to help me help the line move faster? Is it going to solve the traffic problem? Is it going to get me to the meeting on time? I just don't want adrenaline driving my life. And some folks in this field have been driven by adrenaline so long that they live with that all the time. And so I think the 3 Bs, or mindfulness in general, a meditation or prayer, all these things can be preventative in the sense that we're practicing this way before it happens. The 3 Bs can help you before you give a speech, before you take a test, before you confront somebody. These are tools that I hope that people will just embrace as a way of calming themselves, that adrenaline is typically not necessary in most of our adult lives. It's great for athletics, it's great for a challenge, but it's not great for anger, it's not great for discipline, it's not great if I don't know that I'm hot firing. It can be a real detriment to people.
All right, last question of the day, and this kind of speaks on what your the description of your webinar actually discussed. Let's see. At first, let's see, where did it moved up on me? I apologize. I feel as though first responders and sworn personnel have more access to the debriefings and other tools. However, the crime scene investigators and medical examiners tend to be left out or forgotten about. What are your thoughts on how to bridge the gap to where everybody has more access to those tools?
Well, first of all, making the CISD team aware that you're interested would be helpful. Personally, I wish that every crime lab, every person that's exposed to child sex crimes, people who are exposed to these traumatic slides or pictures and so on, that they should all have access to a professional to speak with. The training that I give is meant to be kind of broad in nature. I do give many examples of people that have been exposed to things and how they've gotten help. But I think a crime lab personnel can go to their director and say, we would like to have somebody available. The training is helpful, but I think on a regular basis, some departments have an anonymous way of contacting the professional, and the professional goes in to see the therapist, the psychologist, and the agency is billed and no one knows who that person was. So there are ways of working through this where you have access to that. And I want to just, again, thank people who are out there listening who do this for year after year after year and are traumatized. Please find the resources to keep your spirit up, to keep your optimism, your enjoyment of life, your mindfulness, your appreciation of your home and your family. Please do what it takes to keep yourself psychologically healthy. To do this kind of work and in the end be depressed or suicidal, or to be negative, or to have had several marriages that failed because of your work, those are things that we really want to avoid.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Christiansen. Before we do move into our closing, I just wanted to open the floor up to you one more time, just to leave us with any final words.
Well, I think that the most difficult part of this is getting a culture to accept mental health services. I don't mean that just from professionals. I can mean that from a close friend who listens carefully to that. I really don't want to advertise or advocate for people to be forced into therapy. It's also difficult to sit by and watch somebody who you know is drinking more than they should, who is being abusive at home, who's not dealing with the stress. It's very difficult to watch that happen and not create a bond between law enforcement and mental health. I think it's an area that still needs work. We don't want to force anybody into that, but often those that are most against it are the ones that can struggle the most as well. And so I want to be part of that bridge. Again, it comes out of respect for people who are saying, you don't have to witness this. I will do it. Call 911 and you can let it go. We'll take care of it from here. I love people that are willing to do that. Or in the case of crime lab folks, we are willing to do what it takes to get this person to justice. We will do this. We'll expose ourselves to trauma on behalf of the community, on behalf of our citizenry. These people need to be respected. And if they have mental health concerns, they need to have resources that are available that they want to have.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Christiansen. We are going to go ahead and wrap things up for the day. Again, obviously, we would like to thank Dr. David Christiansen for his presentation and all of the research and everything he has done in this field. We would definitely like to thank all of our participants for today's webinar as well. Without your support and attending our webinars, we simply would not be able to make these possible. So thank you for joining us for today. You will also find in the middle of your screen a short survey. So if you wouldn't mind clicking on that word here, we'll open up a new window for you, and you'll be able to run through our short customer satisfaction survey. All the information that we do collect is vital information that we like to use to make sure that we do provide the best webinar experience, and also adjust the content and way we disseminate that information out to you, our audience. So if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments on that, we would definitely appreciate it. You will see down there as well in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there is a file share pod. Dr. Christiansen was also kind enough to allow us to download today's slide deck directly from the room. So if you want to get a copy of today's slide deck, simply click on the title there of the file and then click the download files button directly below that, and you will be able to download the slide deck from today's presentation. We are recording today's webinar as we do with all of our webinars, so we will have the archival version up in the next few days. We will be sending out an email directly to everyone that did register, so look out for that email and you'll be able to review back to today's presentation, also pass along to any colleagues that you find would benefit from today's webinar. Also in the chat pod, we are going to be putting up a number of our social media outlets, such as Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So make sure that you're following us on all of our social media outlets to get the latest and greatest of what we're doing with the FTCOE. There you go. Tyler just put that up there for us. And then also we have our podcast as well as our website to check out all of our at no cost offerings to the forensic community. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Christiansen, for your time, and thank you for all of our audience for joining us today, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon.